Well, good morning, everyone who made the trek through the rain to get here by 8:30. Your support's usually appreciated, and more importantly, your interest in the Asian markets is appreciated. I've been given an untenable task, which was to talk about Asian markets. That's a little like asking some of you to tell a Chinese person all about the European markets in 45 minutes, if possible. But I'll give you a taste of the Asian markets, give you some highlights. Many of you asked me questions yesterday, so I have perhaps a few more slides in the presentation that I intended. So please know that I'll be moving quite quickly, and there are loads. Now you might be wondering why I would be talking about the Asian markets. I admit I don't look typically Asian, but I've spent my professional career in Asia. I first went to China and Hong Kong in the early 80s. These were the days before we could use currencies in China and greatly restricted travel. And I've lived in Asia 31 years. I have written books on the Asian market. Actually, there's a couple more that aren't in this slide, and just about to be released is one on the Pearl River Delta, southern China. My company works with many different activities, including wine competition, conferences, festivals. We organize 200 to 300 events each year, Pan-Asia, roughly in those markets. That was last year's activity. We represent wine regions and some wine brands, some favorite wine brands, and then generally I try to build up the professionalism of the wine trade in Asia. So that's what I do. But first of all, we need to start with what is Asia, because unfortunately for the Asians, there is no clear boundary of what is and what isn't Asia. And one of the things I've noticed with Europeans, they include a lot of countries in Asia that the Asians themselves do not consider Asia. So certainly South Asia is firmly part of our Asian ethos, and the countries named here, Southeast Asia, East Asia, but where we draw the line is Pakistan. So the rest of the countries like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan are not really considered Asian by the Asians. And in fact, recently people referred to Turkey as Asian, and even Georgia, with whom we work, as Asian, and it shocked the Asians. So this is roughly what we consider Asia, but if it's Rugby World Cup, then we include Australia and New Zealand in Asia, and a few other islands in the region. So roughly we're 36 to 38 countries comprise Asia. But when it comes to wine, there's only a few countries we're truly concerned about today. And first and foremost is the highest per capita importer, which is Hong Kong, where I've made my home for 31 years. Followed by Japan, Singapore, Korea, and then Taiwan. I'll make a few comments, of course China. I'll make a few comments about Singapore, Macau as well. So let's start with Korea. Korea is the third largest, potential in Asia. Its population is not so large, but the per capita consumption is high. They're still in an early market stage, not so mature, not caring so much about what they're drinking, but they do have an incredibly strong economy in spite of King Jong-un's threats to the north. The early stages negotiated quite a few interesting free trade agreements. Chile was one of the first countries out of the gate, and therefore has a competitive advantage. But one of the key features of this market is they are heavy drinkers. I have Korean friends in Hong Kong that have passed out on a small ferry and just went back and forth for hours. Now, if I did that, I'd be so ashamed, but they just think it's normal. So, heavy drinking, and the youth culture in Seoul is alive like it's never been before. And I think the most fascinating thing to have watched for me is Korea has become the trend center of Asia. All my Hong Kong friends, and my friends are all Chinese, they all watch Korean soap operas. They follow Korean pop bands. One of my girlfriends had us all fly to Korea for her 40th birthday, where she had engaged special pop bands, and we went to film studios. Korea is hot, hot, hot in Asia, something that's been unprecedented. They went from kind of a poor relation to the coolest people in Asia. So what are they drinking? Of course, France has a substantial position, as they do everywhere in Asia. Red wine dominates, but they do have some substantial support from Chile. And then you'll see I put little Portugal at the top at 0.5%. So I hope, at some stage we can see some growth. Something that's interesting about Korea is that the market is controlled by a few families, chaebols. It's not exactly mafia, but you could think of it as like a mafia, because these few families control integrated industries all the way through to supermarket. So if you can get your wines in, then you'll have a success story, but tough to break into this market. It's a little bit like the UK supermarket stranglehold, except in this case it's families. Japan is a much more mature market. Of course, Japan was the first country in Asia besides Hong Kong to have substantial wealth coming out of the last few decades. So naturally they started drinking wine first and looked to the West early on for a kind of sophisticated trends. So this market continues to have very stable growth, and they have a good tax regime. The taxes in Japan are deemed quite fair, and wine is very much part of some people's lifestyle, mainly the city lifestyle. And then as Japan has an incredible drinking culture as well, both Ganbei style, but also slightly more sophisticated drinking style, and a particularly strong sommelier base. So they have the largest group of certified sommeliers in Asia, and they take their studies very seriously. So you will hear there are 3,000 sommeliers in Japan in the Somm Society. It doesn't mean they all work the floor, it just means that they've all studied to a certain level. Singapore. Singapore is a fun market. I love Singapore. Smaller population, widely overlooked, except by the Australians, because when Australians go to the European markets, they have to stop somewhere. So they chose Hong Kong or Singapore traditionally as their stop en route to Europe. And of course, Singapore is much closer to Australia, so they have a competitive advantage. Another feature of the Singapore market is they do re-export. They act as a wine hub for Southeast Asia. So you can see in this chart that 68% of the importers in Singapore export to Southeast Asia. I want to tell you a little bit about these statistics. They are unofficial. They're mine. So I wrote a number of books I mentioned, and in writing the books, I survey all the importers. And we work very, very, very hard to get every single importer's input into the book. But you must understand, when there are these colorful charts, they're based on what the importers tell me and what I can check. So these are not government statistics, these are research statistics. Another question that I asked Singaporeans is, how much of your wine is sold to what we call non-Western? If you're familiar with the term Western, it means everyone except Asia. So it's a PC, politically correct term to describe all other peoples. So I was curious, what percentage of their wine is being sold to Asian restaurants? So Singapore has the highest percentage of wine actually being sold into Asian restaurants. You'll see in Hong Kong, it's simply not the case. The wine is sold in Western restaurants. Also, it's quite interesting to understand the breakdown in the types of people drinking in Singapore, because many of you will know Singapore is a mixed populace of Indian, Malay, Chinese, and some, of course, expats. So in Singapore, Chinese constitute 53%. The expatriate, foreigner market is huge. Not surprising, the Malaysian market would be small because Malaysians are largely Muslim, but the Indian population knows how to drink a bit in Singapore. In Hong Kong, you can see it's much more Chinese. The volume sold is much more to the Chinese community. And that brings me to India. And what do I want to tell you about India? If you want to understand India thoroughly, just talk to Speach Aurora, who's sitting down there. It's a complex market, it's greatly fragmented. I'm sure you've heard different regulations by province, different drinking habits, different religions, different cultures. People are traditionally spirits drinkers, particularly whiskey. I've been to dinners in India that at midnight we were still drinking whiskey and had not started eating yet. So they're great drinkers, but perhaps not so strong with wine. But we're very pleased recently, our first Master of Wine, Sonal Anand in India, and I think it's also raising some attention for the wine industry. So Speach sitting right here. Taiwan. Now I get into trouble. Because when we talk about China, it's always confusing. Are we talking about mainland China, the PRC, or are we talking about what we call Greater China? So we have an expression, Greater China includes everything. In that case, we're talking about People's Republic of China mainland, Macau, Hong Kong, Taiwan. But then when you're in Hong Kong, it's very confusing. So if you're getting an importer in Hong Kong or Taiwan or Macau, you have to be very clear, what territory are we describing? Because Hong Kong people will refer to Hong Kong as being China in one hand, and then 5 minutes later talk about the mainland or those people. Okay? So we do make a distinction, but sometimes we include everything. So your question to ask always, are we talking about Greater China, everything, or mainland China? Even sometimes people say motherland or the PRC, but mostly we would say mainland China. So Taiwan, of course, views itself apart. China views Taiwan part of China. So I wrote a book on the Taiwan market. I love this market. Taiwan market is small, but it is not a miniature China market. It does not reflect China at all. It's quite a different market. So it has medium maturity. Growth is actually pretty flat, but I feel that's because no one's making an effort in Taiwan. Everyone forgot about Taiwan in the rush to the mainland, Shanghai. So very few winemakers visit this market, and I see huge opportunity here. The taxes are very fair in Taiwan, and I wrote Counterfeit Bear. I interviewed 97 importers. As far as I can tell, there are only 99. Two turned me down. And the importers, every single interview is the same. Tell me about counterfeits. What issues have you seen with counterfeits? In fact, everyone looked a little puzzled. Counterfeit? Fake? No. And one or two could have been pretending, but not everyone in the trade. Journalists, importers, songs. So I think they're fairly clean as a market. But what is tricky about the Taiwanese market is BYOB. Do you know BYOB? Mm-hmm. Bring your own bottle. Okay, so in Hong Kong we love it too. We collect a bunch of Lafite and then we carry them into the restaurant for dinner. And Taiwan, they take it to the extreme. About 95% of the F&B, food and beverage market, is BYOB. So people bring their own bottles to the restaurant. Now this happened in Hong Kong very naturally because in Hong Kong, the Chinese restaurants never sold wine. So if we were having Chinese food, we had to bring our own wine. And they would let us. They didn't charge corkage in Hong Kong, now they do. But not always. You can negotiate if you're a regular. In Taiwan, it's to the extreme. They BYOB all the time. And in fact, it's so bad that they will call the importer and say, importer, send some wine to the restaurant. I want some Australian, try to think of a brand quickly, some Penfolds tonight for dinner. Can you ship it to this restaurant? So they completely cut out the song. So as a result, there's really only two sommeliers in Taiwan. and they're both with French outlets, Sofitel and Novotel. So they have zero buying power and influence in Taiwan. They do have a solid specialist retail market, and it's absolutely fascinating, some of the outlets. So one I went to, she only carries 50 bottles, and it's in a residential building, out a little bit suburban, and in the window there's a Christian Dior book, Louboutin, sandals, Prada bag, and wine bottles. And then you buzz the door to get let in. And I said, how on earth do people find you out here? And she said, oh, they call me and make appointments. Oh my God, what a business. But most of it's fascinating, and she's very successful. Partly by keeping her portfolio lean. She only carries 50, and she rotates the 50. But the other trend I see in Taiwan is retail outlets also have storage and food on site. So you buy the wine, you store it in your locker, and then you go in with your friends to have bar snack style food and get your wine out of the locker and drink. In this market, youth rocks. Again, it's a youth-driven, youth-wealthy culture and another country with drinking culture. So where are they getting their wine? France, as usual, but also Australia has good presence, but this is the only country that has a strong Spanish presence. Sadly, most of those are value wines, but there are collectible Spanish wines in this market, and this is something I've never seen that percentage anywhere else in Asia. Macau. Macau is an irregular market. Can I say it's sophisticated or immature? Who knows? The people living there in the trade are well trained. They understand wine quite well. However, their clientele are mainly there on tourism and to gamble. So the songs tell me it's a difficult market to work because you never get to know anyone. And they said your customers are either super happy or super depressed. I'm reminded of that old expression about that Napoleon said, you drink it in victory, you drink it in defeat. The drinking in Macau is very much that way. Usually famous brands and often provided by the gambling outlet. So there are only 6, but it's the largest gambling center of the world. There's more money gambled in Macau in 1 month than the rest of the world combined. Enormous money. Hong Kong. So we have 0 tax on wine. We're positioned to be the hub, the center of the Asian wine world. But the result of that is also that we're highly unregulated. You do not need to register to be a wine importer. You could move there tomorrow, open a business the same day, and import wine the same day, close the business at night. That's how easy it is in Hong Kong. So the result is we have approximately 350 importers for a population of 8 million. Of these importers, about 20 dominate, 80 are solid, and the rest come and go. So the result of this fragmentation is some shifts in the market. We have expanding portfolios, mid-market growth, I'll explain that in a minute, and our auction craze is finally slowing down a little, and we're a fairly mature market. So we have a group of people, incredibly sophisticated. Robert referred to some of them. They will ask me, Debra, at Léoville Las Casas in 1743, what was the name of the uncle that owned a portion of the winery? These are the kinds of questions I get. So they study a few brands deeply. So how did this all come about? In 2008, Hong Kong took a really bold move and removed all our duty. When I was studying for the Master of Wine exams, damn it, duty was 100%. So it was so expensive to taste wine, very difficult. Vino Verde cost me about $40 a bottle. So this tax-free status was joy for all of us that loved wine in Hong Kong. When Hong Kong did it, they wanted to unleash the market to get everyone excited, so they invited every auction house to Hong Kong, which Maureen will tell you is a good news, bad news story. And some of the other effects of this positioning Hong Kong as a fine wine hub is, of course, our import volumes went up far more than 100%, 1,000%. Our re-export about 250%. That means importing to Hong Kong and shipping out mainly to China or Vietnam. And then our BYOB culture grew. And this is because everyone was buying old vintage at auction. You heard me yesterday asking about old vintage TCA. And I have to tell you, Hong Kong is the most spoiled market in the world because everyone bought these huge collections at auction, and suddenly we have to drink those wines. So if you like old vintage, pop by Hong Kong, make a few Hong Kong Chinese friends. You won't believe what you'll be served. The other thing that happened is our customs facilitation. We put in a special agreement that wines can arrive in Hong Kong and go through customs in Hong Kong and go into China. So Chinese customs were notoriously difficult. So this idea by our government was bring the wine through Hong Kong, it's much easier. In reality, this mostly is working with southern China. Most people are passing through for southern China, which is 300 million people. So Hong Kong is actually quite full, but very experienced. China, of course, is the big, exciting market, so why would anyone want to establish themselves in Hong Kong? Well, we do have some advantages. Hong Kong has a premium image. We're a cultural converter, and that term came from my team in my office. That's how they view Hong Kong. That China looks to Hong Kong to understand cultural trends. And we are very trend-setting, although Shanghai gives us a bit of a run for trend-setting these days. But also, we're the price benchmarking. Hong Kong is considered a fair market, so prices are accepted. And we're considered an authentic market, a market not only for wine, but luxury goods. People queue up, 200 people in front of Louis Vuitton in Hong Kong. And I think, why? You have 14 Louis Vuitton outlets in Shanghai. But they come to Hong Kong because they're sure it's authentic. China, not always sure. And the same goes for wine. And of course, Hong Kong is an environment famous for easy to do business. There's so many entrepreneurs in Hong Kong because it is easy to facilitate, hire, and trade. It's a trading center. So market facilitation is our expertise. And we have an internal market, re-export market, and of course, robust markets. So now let's talk about China, because I think that's all you really wanted to hear about. So what's different about China to Hong Kong? Taxes are high, 45% plus. So there's a variable tax onto that. Average, you probably pay about 54% tax. The important importers are much more concentrated than they are in the other markets. They're continuing to expand portfolios, but the big guys are more or less full. They're just trading labels. Solid mid-market growth in recent years, lots of counterfeit scares, and then in 2000, it's been a few years now, 5 years, the austerity scares really shook up this market when President Xi, president at that time, put in measures to cut all gift-giving between government officials and try to stamp out corruption. So what is China actually? Talking about China is like talking about Europe and a half. This is a huge country. 33, maybe some of you have studied WSET and learned there are 33 Grand Cru in Burgundy, if you include Chablis. Well, there are 33 provinces to think about in China. So the key provinces, though, are selling only importing 95% of the market. There are 8 provinces that are really dominating the market, and here is where they're located. No surprise, they're all on the seaside, where ports and shipping and exposure to Western culture traditionally has been much stronger. So is this a mature market or is it an immature market? You really have to answer that question city by city and segment by segment. Some of the most sophisticated wine drinkers in the world are in China, I assure you, but they mainly know Bordeaux. Mainly Bordeaux. The rest of the world is a bit of a mystery to these people, and they refuse to shift out of the maybe top 20 brands of Porto. And then on the other hand, you have one of the most immature markets in the world. It's still very much red dominated, and sparkling wine has actually struggled. White wine always struggles in all of Asia, and rosé hasn't even appeared yet. Okay, so big brands dominate in China. They're not yet at a stage where they're excited to discover boutique. You know, one time I was saying, oh, I got this amazing little wine, it's so cute. It's a tiny little winery, and great-grandpa, and the dog, and the little baby sitting on the barrel. It's such a wonderful wine. And the person I was speaking to got very disappointed. I said, what's wrong? Oh, I thought it was a good wine. I said, yes, it's a good wine. That's why I'm showing you. They said, well, if it were good, why isn't it big? So there's still that mindset that if you're good, you're going to grow. Okay? So boutique only works with certain parts of the market segment. No gifting. Before, wine was bought, a high percentage of wine was bought as gifting. In fact, we have a great re-gifting culture where you get a gift and you give it to someone else and someone else. One time I got a bottle of Dom Perignon from a friend, and it had a gift card in it to Jeannie Cho Lee, one of my Quimperella W's in Hong Kong. So people pass these things along, and so sometimes the numbers were deceptive because no one's actually opening the bottles. They display them on the shelf. When Xi decreed no gifting, what he meant was he needed to put a stop to what was happening between the fire department, the police department, the electricians, and the plumbing of a city. They were all giving each other Lafitte at Chinese New Year. Okay? So he was cutting departmental spending. But this gutted the market because everyone was very heavily invested in fine wine. The good news is it helped shift the market more into mid-priced wines. Another feature of this market has been our empty bottles. Our empty bottles have a hot secondary market. So on all the top e-commerce sites, you can find empty bottles for about $25 US. So an empty Lafitte. This is mainly due to our counterfeit culture. So there are many anti-counterfeit measures now being established in the market, and Maureen will shock you with that story later. Our logistics, I think, are nothing unusual. We have state-subsidized importers. We have